Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Jerzen and I'm a second year medical student. In this video, I'm going to be going over the techniques and tools that I use to make efficient and smart notes from my university lectures. If you're anything like me, ever since I was in high school, my preferred method of note-taking was to watch the lecture and then summarize everything into points and paragraphs. My revision method would be to just go over the whole thing again and read it or highlight it. But if you have watched my older videos on active recall and spaced repetition, you know that those aren't the most efficient revision techniques. So what are the tools and techniques that you need to actually make smarter and more efficient notes? I personally use RemNote to take down all my university notes. You can use pen and paper, or you can use an iPad, or you can use Notion or Obsidian or anything you prefer, but the tool doesn't really matter. It's more about the technique that you use. So before the coronavirus pandemic, we used to actually go into a lecture hall and have face-to-face lectures, but now we have video lectures and sometimes we have presentations which we need to go through. No matter what your initial material is, the techniques that you apply are basically going to be the same. So we're going to divide the note-taking process into 3 time frames. The first one is pre-lecture, and the second one is during the lecture, and the third one is after the lecture or post-lecture. Before the lecture, I like to do 2 things. One is pre-reading, and the second one is actually writing out and scoping the subject. Pre-reading is exactly what it sounds like. It's when you read the material or the lecture or the textbook or whatever you use before you actually go through it in a proper manner. You should definitely try to avoid taking in all the information at once. You should run through the material many times and eventually build up your information bank. Scoping the subject is essentially when you write down the topics or the main points of the lecture, and this essentially helps you in figuring out what's important so you don't waste a lot of time on the smaller things. I like to do this with mind maps. So on my iPad, I would just open Notability, take my pencil, and I would just write down the main topics that I see in a sort of mind map kind of fashion. And that allows you to see where everything connects and how everything looks like from a bird's eye perspective. Now, while you're watching the lecture, I would highly recommend taking quick and concise notes. If you follow the previous step of scoping the subject and you wrote down all the important topics and headings, you know where everything falls into place and you know what's going to come ahead. And using that under each topic, you can just write down small bullet points. You don't necessarily have to write everything because for the most part, the material is right there in front of you. You need to make cues for yourself. This can be done in a multitude of ways. So if you have an iPad like I do, you can download the lecture slides and write on them directly, or you can do it on pen and paper, but this would involve the extra step of writing down all the headings and the subheadings and the topics before you attend or watch or read the lecture. Now, the most important part is post-lecture note-taking, and this is when you would fill in all the gaps and then you would create cues for yourself, which you can use to revise later. If you watch my previous video, you know that the most efficient revision techniques are active recall and spaced repetition. If you haven't checked out that video, it'll be linked right here. Keeping those techniques in mind, now we're going to structure our primitive notes and make them into something that is more valuable for us. So your goal is to make proper active recall cues. This can come in the form of flashcards, questions and answers, or you can just write down keywords on the side of the paper. What I would do is as soon as the lecture is over or in the evening when I have a bit of time and I'm reviewing everything, I would fill in the gaps of my knowledge. So I would go through the notes that I have taken during the lecture and I would use Wikipedia or Google, and I'm essentially trying to explain the topic to myself or to the wall and breaking the topic down to its core elements. This is something called the Feynman technique, and this is single-handedly one of the most important and most useful tactics that I've been using in the past year for my studying. So once you've filled all the gaps in your knowledge, you can start making the cues you need for active recall. If you use an application like RemNote, you can automatically make the flashcards, but you can do this in a multitude of different ways if you don't prefer using flashcards. If you don't prefer using flashcards, my other favorite technique is questions and answers. You can do this in apps like RemNote with the toggle feature, or even Notion, where you would hide a certain amount of text or certain amount of information underneath a question and you hide it from yourself. It's the same principle as a flashcard because active recall is essentially just testing yourself on the information that you've studied. But the benefits of using an application like RemNote is that it has automatic spaced repetition scheduling, so you don't necessarily have to think about it again. It's just going to do all the hard work on the calculations for you, and it'll just spit out the questions and you answer them, and eventually you'll be studying. If flashcards and toggles aren't your game, you can also use keywords, and this is especially useful for people that tend to take notes on paper. So you can divide the paper into 2 and you can write keywords on one side with your notes on the other. So when you're revising, you would hide the answers and you would just go through the keywords and try to recall everything that you can. And what's important is that it's fine if you get it wrong, because That's part of the learning process. If you forget it, you undergo a process called hypercorrection, and that'll essentially make you remember it for the long run. So for a quick recap, you need to divide your note-taking process into 3 bits. The first bit is pre-lecture, and that's when you would scope the subject and figure out what you're going to be studying, what the most important things are. The second part is during the lecture. This is when you would take quick and concise notes, just trying to put in the information that's not given to you directly. And the third bit, which is arguably the most important, is post-lecture. And this is when you would go through the material again and you would fill in all the gaps in your knowledge using the Feynman technique or explaining to yourself. And you would keep techniques like active recall and spaced repetition in mind, so you can design your notes around that so you can study efficiently in the future. So that's it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed the content, consider subscribing and also liking the video. Here is a link to some other videos that I made on studying, and check it out. So that's it. Bye-bye.